Before I tell you what happened last Sunday, I need to go back a little. Not all the way to the beginning, just far enough so you understand why I never questioned it. Why I never once thought that a phone call at 7 in the morning could be anything other than love. I'm 63 years old. I retired from 28 years with the Oregon Department of Transportation 2 years ago, and I've been living alone in the same house in Medford since my wife, Carol, passed away from a stroke 4 years back. It's a 2-bedroom ranch on a quiet street. Nothing fancy. But Carol picked out the hydrangeas along the front walk, and I've kept them going because that feels like the right thing to do. I'm not a man who makes friends easily. I keep to myself. I cook my own meals, I watch the Blazers when they're worth watching, and I take my blood pressure medication every morning with a glass of orange juice. That's the routine. That's been the routine for 2 years now. My son is 37. He lives about 40 minutes south of me, down in Ashland, where he worked for a tech company that built software for logistics companies. He was good at his job, or at least I always believed he was. He had an apartment, a girlfriend for a while, a life that seemed to be moving in the right direction. After his mother died, we grew closer than we'd ever been when he was a teenager. He started calling more often, checking in. And about 18 months ago, the calls settled into a pattern that I found, honestly, touching. Every Sunday morning, at 7 o'clock exactly, my phone would ring, his name on the screen. I'd pick up, and he'd ask the same questions in roughly the same order. Had I taken my medication? How did I sleep? Did anyone come by the house? Was the heat working all right? I'd answer each one, he'd seem satisfied, and we'd chat for another 10 or 15 minutes about whatever: football, the garden, his work. Then he'd say he loved me, and we'd hang up. I told people about those calls. My neighbor, Patrice, who has 3 grown kids who never seem to call at all, said she envied me. My old buddy Frank, who I'd worked with for 15 years on the highway crew, said I'd raised my son right. And I believed that. I was proud of it. I thought that losing his mother had made my son attentive in a way that grief sometimes does. It shakes you awake, reminds you that the people you love are not permanent fixtures. I had no reason to think otherwise. Until last Sunday. Frank had been planning to drive up from Grants Pass since before Christmas. He'd had knee surgery back in November, and this was the first weekend he felt well enough to make the trip. I told him he could stay in the spare room. We'd watch the game, I'd make my chili, and we'd catch up the way we used to before retirement pulled us to opposite ends of the valley. He arrived Saturday afternoon. We sat on the back porch until nearly midnight, talking the way old men do when they finally have the time, slowly, wandering, drifting back through years. Sunday morning, I was up at 6:30. I'd already made coffee and was thinking about how to explain to Frank that I needed a few minutes at 7, that my son always called, that it was a thing I didn't like to miss. But Frank was still asleep. The house was quiet. And when my phone rang at exactly 7 o'clock and I saw my son's name, something made me hesitate before I answered. I don't know exactly what it was. It wasn't suspicion, not yet. It was more like a flicker of something I didn't have a name for. Maybe it was the way the house felt different with someone else in it, with another set of eyes around. Maybe it was just that Frank's presence reminded me of who I used to be before I became, without quite noticing it, a man who gave a weekly accounting of himself to his child. I answered the phone. My son said good morning, and his voice was what it always was, warm, careful, measured. He asked if I'd taken my blood pressure pill. I said yes, I had. He asked how I'd slept. Fine, I said. Then he asked the question he always asked third. Is anyone there with you? And I don't know why I don't fully understand it even now, but I said no. I said, no, it's just me. Quiet morning. There was a pause on his end. Brief, maybe 2 seconds. Then he said, good. Okay, good. And the rest of the conversation was normal. He asked about the weather. I told him the hydrangeas were finally showing new growth for spring. He said, that was nice. He said he loved me. I said, I loved him too. We hung up. I stood in the kitchen with my coffee and a feeling I couldn't name. Not guilt, exactly, just a strange awareness that I'd lied, that it had come easily and that he had sounded for just that fraction of a second, relieved. Frank came down around 8. I made eggs and we ate at the kitchen table. We'd been sitting there maybe 40 minutes when Frank set his fork down and looked at me in the way he always did when he was about to say something he'd been sitting on. "I noticed something last night," he said, "when I was washing up in the bathroom. That pill organizer you keep on the counter." I told him that was my weekly medication setup. Carol had bought me the organizer years ago, the kind with 7 compartments, one for each day, with little letter tabs. I'd kept using it because it worked. Frank said, "Yesterday was Saturday, right? So that compartment should have been empty?" I said, "Yes. I take the pill first thing in the morning. It's always empty by Saturday." He nodded slowly. The Saturday slot still had a pill in it. I felt something cool move through my chest. I set my own fork down. I told him that was strange. Maybe I'd forgotten it happened sometimes, though not often. But he was looking at me with that expression I remembered from 28 years of working beside him, the one he got when something on a job site didn't add up and everyone else was walking past it. He said, "It wasn't your usual pill. I know what those look like, white, oval. This one was white too, but it was round, different size." I didn't say anything for a long moment. Then I got up and went to the bathroom. He was right. I stood there looking at that little round pill in the Saturday slot of my organizer, and I tried to think of an explanation that made sense. A mix-up at the pharmacy. A pill that had rolled in from somewhere. But the organizer sat in the same spot on the same bathroom counter, and nobody came into my house except for me. And my son, when he visited. My son visited every 2 or 3 weeks. He would always spend a little time in the house before we went anywhere. He'd use the bathroom. He'd get a glass of water from the kitchen. He'd sometimes go look at the thermostat in the hallway, which he said I always kept too low. At the time, I'd found this endearing. He was looking after the place, looking after me. I picked up the pill and held it in my palm. Frank stood in the bathroom doorway, and neither of us said what we were both thinking. I called my pharmacist that afternoon. She was not on duty, but her colleague, a young man who sounded patient and kind, listened while I described the pill, the shape, the size, the white coating, the faint line scored across the middle. He put me on hold for 2 minutes. When he came back, he told me it sounded like it could be a diuretic, a water pill, the kind that, taken on top of a blood pressure medication without proper supervision, could cause significant drops in blood pressure, dizziness, confusion. In older patients, he said carefully, it could cause falls. It could, in certain circumstances, look like the early signs of cognitive decline. I sat down on the edge of my bed when he said that. I sat there for a long time. Frank found me there. He sat down next to me without saying anything at first. Then he asked me, quietly, what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was find an explanation that wasn't the one forming in the back of my mind like something dark rising through water. I wanted to believe there had been a mistake, that this was a coincidence, that my son, the boy who called every Sunday at 7 o'clock to ask if I'd slept well, had not been standing in my bathroom replacing my medication. But I also thought about the calls, the questions, always in the same order. The third question, the one about whether anyone was there. I thought about the half-second pause, when I'd told him I was alone, and the way he'd said good not as an acknowledgement, but as something closer to satisfaction. I thought about all the Sundays I'd answered honestly, told him yes. I was alone. No one had been by. All the Sundays he'd known exactly what he was working with. Last Sunday, I had not been alone. I had lied. And because I had lied, nothing had happened. Frank slept in the spare room again that night. I didn't. I sat in the kitchen and I thought about my son. I went backward through 18 months of Sunday calls, trying to find the moment when something had changed in him. And I found it, or I thought I did. About 1.5 years ago, right around the time the calls became a weekly ritual, he had lost his job. He hadn't told me directly. I'd found out in a sideways way, through something he'd let slip about working from home. And when I'd pressed, he'd admitted the company had gone through layoffs. He said he had savings. He said he was fine. I'd believed him because I wanted to believe him. His mother and I had drawn up our wills after she was first diagnosed with hypertension, maybe 15 years ago. Mine hadn't been updated since she died. I'd meant to get around to it. The house was worth considerably more than we'd paid for it. Medford property had gone up sharply since we bought in 2001. Between the property and my pension and the savings account Carol and I had built over decades, there was more there than I'd ever really sat down to calculate. I hadn't thought of any of this as something anyone would want to harm me for. It was just our life, the ordinary accumulation of a working life. But I thought about it now, in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, and it felt different. It felt like something someone might look at from the outside and see as a way out. Monday morning, I called my doctor's office when they opened and asked to speak with my physician. I explained what I had found. I explained what the pharmacist had told me. My doctor asked me to come in that afternoon and bring all of my current medications, the pill from the organizer included. She was a thorough woman, direct and unruffled, and she examined everything without visible alarm. She sent the round pill to a testing lab. She ran my blood work, which she said I should have been doing more regularly anyway. The results she had immediately were not reassuring. My potassium levels were lower than they should have been. Not dangerously low, but consistently low, in a way that she said could explain the fatigue I'd mentioned over the past several months, the heaviness in the mornings, the occasional dizziness when I stood up too fast. I had mentioned these things to her at a checkup in October. She had chalked it up to age and the adjustment of retirement. We'd agreed to monitor it, she said to me, in the careful way that doctors speak when they're asking something significant. Has anyone else been managing your medications for you, or had access to them? I drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside. The next 2 days were some of the strangest of my life. My son called on Tuesday, not the Sunday call, just a midweek check-in, the kind he did occasionally. I answered. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that was going cold, and I looked out at the hydrangeas while he talked. He sounded normal. He asked how I was feeling. I said fine. He said he was thinking about driving up that weekend, maybe Saturday, if that worked for me. I said sure, Saturday was fine, come for lunch. When I hung up, I called Frank. Frank asked me if I'd thought about going to the police. I told him I had. I told him I'd thought about almost nothing else for 3 days. But I also told him that I was 63 years old and that the person I was considering calling the police about was my son, the only child Carol and I had raised, the boy who, at 10 years old, had cried harder than either of us at the vet's office when we had to put down our dog. The young man who had stood at his mother's grave and held my hand without saying a word because there was nothing to say. Frank said, I know, but that doesn't change what's in your bathroom. I knew he was right. I also knew that I needed to understand more before I did anything. I needed to understand how far this had gone, how long, whether I was seeing something clearly or constructing a terrible story out of fragments that didn't fit together the way I was fitting them. Saturday, my son arrived at 11:45. He came through the front door the way he always did, with his jacket half unzipped, looking slightly rushed, the way he'd looked since he was a teenager and could never quite manage to be fully on time. He hugged me in the entryway and asked how I was feeling. Good, I said. Really good, actually. I had set things up carefully. I'd removed my pill organizer from the bathroom and replaced it with an identical one I'd bought the day before, stocked only with my correct prescribed medication, verified. I'd also, on Frank's suggestion, bought a small camera, the kind people use for watching pets, and placed it inside the bedroom closet, angled toward the hallway through the partially open door. I want to be clear. I am not a suspicious man by nature. Setting up a camera in my own house made me feel ill. But Frank had driven up on Thursday just to help me do it right, and I had let him because I understood that my need to believe the best about my son could not be allowed to override what I had found in that pill organizer. We had lunch. I made sandwiches. We sat at the kitchen table, and I watched my son's face across the table and tried to see something in it that would tell me I was wrong. He looked tired. He'd always had that look since losing his job, a tightness around the eyes, a quality of sustained tension. He talked about the drive up, about the weather, about a podcast he'd been listening to. He ate his sandwich and drank his coffee and didn't seem like anything other than what he had always been, a tired man in his 30s trying to hold things together. After lunch, he asked if he could use the bathroom. Of course, I said. He was in there for almost 9 minutes. I sat at the kitchen table and I counted the minutes and I hated every one of them. When he came out, he looked slightly different. Not dramatically, not guilty in some obvious way. Just slightly less tense. The way a person looks when they've completed something they'd been carrying. We watched part of the game. Around 3 o'clock, he said he should get back before it got dark. I walked him to the door. He hugged me again. He said he loved me. I said I loved him. I meant it. That was the hardest part. I meant it completely. I watched his car back out of the driveway and disappear down the street, and then I went inside and locked the door and sat down on the couch and didn't move for a long time. The camera footage was clear enough. I watched it on my laptop that evening with Frank on the phone, talking me through it, because I had called him as soon as my son's car was gone and I hadn't wanted to watch it alone. In the footage, my son went into the bathroom and closed the door. After about a minute, there was a brief angle change as he apparently opened the door an inch to listen. Then the door closed again. Then the footage picked him up coming out of the bathroom 2 minutes later, pausing in the hallway, looking toward the living room, and going back in. He was in the bathroom for almost 5 minutes of the 9. I drove to the police station the next morning. I have thought many times, in the months since, about how to describe the process of reporting something like that. There is no clean way to do it. You sit across from a detective, and you tell him that you believe your son has been substituting your medication. And as you say the words out loud, for the first time to a stranger, you hear how they sound. You hear yourself describing the pill organizer, the potassium levels, the camera footage. You hear yourself explaining the Sunday calls and the 9 minutes in the bathroom, and you watch the detective's face as he writes things down. And somewhere under everything you are praying that he will find the thing you missed, the angle that makes this all a terrible misunderstanding. The detective, whose name I won't use here, was a quiet man of about 50, who had a way of asking questions that felt neither aggressive nor dismissive. He took the footage. He took photographs I'd taken of the medications. He told me the lab result on the pill was still pending, which he would follow up on. He said they would need to conduct their own analysis. He asked if my son had ever discussed finances with me. Inheritance. The house. I said yes, a few times. After Carol died, we'd had conversations about the will. Nothing dramatic, just the practical talk that death requires. My son knew what the house was worth. He knew about the pension and the savings. He knew, because I'd told him years ago, that he was the primary beneficiary of everything. The detective asked when my son had lost his job. 18 months ago, I said. He wrote something down. The next 10 days were a different kind of waiting than any I had experienced before. I have waited for surgery results and weather forecasts and the slow end of Carol's last weeks. But this was a waiting that existed alongside the ordinary texture of my life. I still made coffee. I still deadheaded the hydrangeas. I still picked up the phone on Sunday morning when it rang at 7. I answered my son's questions in the same order I always had. I told him I'd taken my medication. I told him I'd slept well. And when he asked if anyone was there with me, I said no, just me. Quiet morning. He said good. He said okay, good. And I sat with that word in my chest like a stone. The detective called me on a Thursday afternoon, 11 days after I'd come into the station. The lab had confirmed the identity of the pill. It was, as the pharmacist had suspected, a diuretic not prescribed to me, not appropriate in combination with my existing medication. The detective told me, in careful language, that his department had begun looking into my son's financial situation. What he found, he relayed with a kind of deliberate neutrality. My son's savings were nearly depleted. He owed back rent on his Ashland apartment. He'd taken out a personal loan 8 months ago. There were credit card balances that had been growing since he lost his job. And 3 months ago, the detective paused before this part. The way people pause before the thing that changes the shape of everything. My son had inquired with an insurance agency about adding a life insurance policy for a parent. He had not yet completed the process, but the inquiry was documented. I thanked the detective, and I set the phone down on my kitchen counter, and I looked out through the window above the sink at the hydrangeas, and I thought about my wife. I thought about how she used to say that our son worried too much, that he carried things he didn't need to carry, that she could see it in him even when he was small. This need to control outcomes, to manage every variable before they could catch him by surprise. She said it with love. She said it the way you name something in a child, not to diminish them but to see them clearly. I thought about whether she would have seen this coming, and I thought, probably, somewhere in the back of her, she might have been afraid of it. 2 days later, my son was brought in for questioning. I was not there. The detective had advised me to stay home, and I did. I sat in the kitchen and I waited. What I learned in the days and weeks that followed came in pieces. Some from the detective, some from my son's court-appointed attorney, who was kind enough to speak with me briefly. Some from my son himself, eventually, in conversations I am still not sure I was ready to have, but had anyway. My son had, over the course of roughly 14 months, been substituting my blood pressure medication with a diuretic that he had obtained without a prescription through a contact he'd made online. Not on every visit irregularly, in the kind of pattern that would be difficult to detect without specific testing. The goal, as best I understand it now, was not immediate. He was not trying to kill me quickly. He was trying, in a slow and methodical way, to make me appear to be declining. Forgetfulness, fatigue, dizziness. The kind of symptoms that an older man living alone might accumulate until someone, perhaps his son, the son who called every Sunday, the son who was so attentive, might need to step in, to manage things, to take over the finances, the house, the accounts. When I first heard this laid out plainly, I could not connect it to the person I knew. The logic of it was so foreign to the man I had raised that I kept looking for where the story broke down. But the story didn't break down. It had happened. What came next, what changed the shape of the story in a way I had not anticipated, was the evaluation. At the recommendation of his attorney, and with the agreement of the court, my son underwent a full psychiatric evaluation. The psychologist's report, which was eventually shared with the family as part of the legal process, described something that I had not known was there, or had not known well enough to name. My son had been experiencing what the report called a paranoid anxiety disorder with obsessive features, which had worsened significantly following the loss of his job. He had developed, over the course of roughly 2 years, an elaborate set of fixed beliefs that I was being manipulated by people around me, that I was in danger of making decisions that would leave him with nothing, that someone, a neighbor, a friend, eventually a woman he believed I was seeing, though I was not, was going to take what was ours. The Sunday calls had begun as genuine concern and had become, without my seeing it, a monitoring system. He was checking, every week, whether the threat he imagined had advanced, whether I was still alone, whether things were still as he believed they needed to be. The psychologist noted that my son did not believe he was doing anything wrong. In his understanding of events, he was protecting his father from exploitation. He was ensuring that I would be cared for by him, under his oversight, in the way that he had decided was correct. The fact that the method he had chosen was harming me was not something that had registered within the framework of his thinking. The fear had become so total that it had reorganized everything else around it. I read that report 3 times. I don't say that to seem thorough. I say it because the first 2 times, I was reading it the way you read something you're hoping will resolve into something else, hoping the words will rearrange themselves into a different conclusion. The 3rd time, I read it the way you read something that is true. My son was sick. He had been sick for longer than either of us had known, and the sickness had grown in the dark, in the space between Sunday phone calls and quiet weeks, in the gap between what he was experiencing inside and what he was able to say out loud. The legal process is something I won't walk through in detail, partly because it's still ongoing in some respects, and partly because it isn't the heart of what I want to tell you. What I will say is that my son received a diagnosis, and that the diagnosis changed what happened to him in a way that felt, to me, like the only outcome I could live with. He was not placed in a prison. He was placed in a treatment program. He has been receiving medication and weekly therapy for several months now. I speak with him on the phone occasionally. The conversations are short and careful in a way that is nothing like the easy calls we used to have. There is damage between us that I don't know how to calculate. There are things I trusted that I cannot simply trust again, at least not yet. And I don't think honesty requires me to pretend otherwise. But I also know this. When my son asked me, every Sunday morning, how I was sleeping, part of that was real. When he stood at his mother's grave and held my hand, that was entirely real. The sickness did not make him a stranger to me. It made him a person I had not fully seen, which is a different and in some ways harder thing. Frank comes up from Grant's Pass more often now. He was there the day I cleaned out the second bathroom cabinet and replaced the organizer and spent an hour making sure I understood, for the first time since Carol died, exactly what was in my medicine, and why, and what each thing was supposed to do. He sat at my kitchen table and drank my coffee and didn't make it sentimental. That's the thing about a friendship of 28 years, it doesn't require much decoration. My doctor adjusted my blood pressure medication after reviewing the blood work from the period of the substitution. She said the effects were, in the long run, reversible. She was pleased that we'd caught it when we did. She said the word caught the way you say a word when you know the alternative, but are choosing not to say it directly. Some nights, I sit on the back porch and think about how close it was. Not just physically, though it was close that way too, but close in the way of missing something, of living next to a thing for a year and a half and calling it by a different name. I called it love, because that's what I was seeing and that's what I wanted to see. I was seeing a man who called every Sunday and asked how I slept and wanted to know I was safe. That was real. That was there. It was just threaded through with something else I couldn't see. The way a rope can be fraying from the inside while it still holds. I think about my wife. I think about the way she used to say, our son carried things he didn't need to carry. I wonder what she would do with this, how she would hold it. She was better than me at holding complicated things without needing to resolve them into something simpler. She could love my son's worry and grieve it at the same time. I am still learning to do that. There is a Sunday morning ritual again now, though it's different. I make my coffee and I take my medication, the correct medication, from the bottle from the pharmacy, and I sit at the kitchen table and I look out at the hydrangeas for a few minutes before the day starts. Some Sundays, the phone rings. Sometimes it's Frank. Sometimes it's my neighbor Patrice, who has started stopping by more since she found out what happened, in the way that neighbors do when the ordinary distance between houses suddenly seems less sensible than it used to. Once or twice, it has been my son's number on the screen. Those calls I answer slowly, the way you approach something that you're still learning not to flinch from. His voice is different now, quieter, more deliberate, the way someone sounds when they're working very hard to choose their words. He asks how I'm doing. I tell him the truth. Sometimes I ask how he's doing, and he tells me the truth too, which is that some days are better than others, and that he is trying. I believe him. I believe him the way you believe something that you cannot afford not to believe, and also the way you believe something because the evidence is there, right in front of you, if you're willing to look without flinching. The last thing I want to tell you, because I think it's the thing that matters most, is about the lie. That Sunday morning last March, when I picked up the phone and, for the first time, told my son that I was alone when I wasn't. I've thought about why I did it. I've tried to trace the instinct backward to its source. And what I come back to is this. I think some part of me already knew. Not the full shape of it, not the details. But some part of me had accumulated enough small wrongnesses over enough Sundays to have a feeling it had not yet put into words. The fatigue that didn't lift. The dizziness on Tuesday morning. The way his voice settled into good when I said I was alone, not with warmth, but with the particular quality of relief that comes from confirming a thing you were afraid had changed. I think some quiet part of me heard that and, just once, decided to give it something different. Just once, decided to see what the truth would do if it traveled in the opposite direction. I'm not telling this story because I think I was clever. I wasn't. I was a 63-year-old man standing in his kitchen lying to his son for reasons he couldn't have explained, and the lie stumbled into saving his life more through grace than any deliberate plan. I'm telling it because I think a lot of people are living next to something they can feel but haven't named yet. Something that sits inside of care, inside of routine, inside of the small, daily things that are supposed to be simple. Sometimes love and harm can wear each other's clothing for a very long time. And sometimes the truest thing you can do is pay attention to the moment when, for no reason you can fully explain, something in you decides to tell a different story. And then when that moment passes, you follow it. I followed it. The hydrangeas are doing well this spring. Carol would have been glad about that. I keep the heat at a temperature I decide for myself now. And on Sunday mornings, I pour my coffee, and I take my medication, and I sit for a while with the quiet before whatever the day brings. Some mornings, the quiet is enough.